Welcome to Superhero Conversations, a podcast saga with innovation leaders who are at SuperNova here in beautiful Antwerp, Belgium. I'm your host, Dominic Dieshuk, and joining me today is one superhero, the head of ecosystem at the Next Web, Yeni Joseph. Welcome.
Thanks.
So, Yeni, how did you end up where you are now? Please give me an overview of what you have done.
Yeah, that's a good question. So currently, I'm as you mentioned in your intro, what we call head of ecosystems, which I would explain as how policies are influencing the tech ecosystem, and that also kind of brings back to my experience. I've been doing a lot of things around tech policies for the past 10 years. So yeah, it's really, I've been kind of at the intersection of tech and policy, done a lot of lobbying for the big tech organizations, learned a lot, have been part of government, and now joined the dark side.
Fantastic. And you mentioned this intersection. And what is the intrinsic motivation behind working both in the government and in the private sector? Because we usually see people working either in that or that. What is your motivation behind it?
Yeah, well, actually, I always explain it to people that tech policies, they kind of intrigue me and annoy me at the same time. I think we cannot say they're not important anymore, whether you like them or not. Like, there's a lot going on in tech policy. But when I was on the government side of things, I always felt that kind of really the conversation with the people we were doing it for was really missing. So that's also what led me to kind of be at that intersection of like, well, I do believe we need governments, and governments are key even for change. But I also feel a lot of times as governments, you speak a whole different language than entrepreneurs. And when it comes to innovation, and I felt it was good to try and bring those worlds together, which is not easy, but I think very important.
Fantastic. And could you bring an example of a tech policy? Because we talk about it quite a lot, but people don't really know. They know that there are some rules and regulations that startups and tech companies should follow. But what is an example of an impactful policy that impacts the technology innovation scene?
Well, I mean, I think a very important one is around talent. I mean, we all know for companies, you can raise a lot of investment, you can have a great technology, but in the end, you need to have the talent to grow your company. And I think when it comes to talent, especially international talent, you kind of look at the immigration part of things, which then becomes very traditional. And I think in many places, and also in Europe, we saw that kind of the whole visa structure about attracting international talent was very outdated. So now there's actually quite a few countries that have what we would call a startup visa or a tech talent visa. Yeah. And I think that's super important. So on one hand, what you see there is that governments acknowledge how important that is, and that looking at tech talent is not the same as looking at talent for corporates, for example, because you talk about different salaries. I also think different motivation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, let's be honest, and I know I'm generalizing here a bit, but I think for a corporate, it's more of a money play. Where I think if you want to join a startup, it's also because you're very passionate for a company and a technology and you really believe in what the company is doing. So then it should more be about, okay, instead of just getting a corporate salary, for example, why don't you then offer also equity in a company? So there's quite a few visa models right now where as a startup, you can attract international talent and you can combine salary with equity to make it more attractive and more realistic for a startup to also hire that talent.
Mm-hmm. And if you could give an overview, your kind of objective or subjective opinion on the current state of the regulatory system inside the European Union, would you describe it as good, bad, needs improvement?
Definitely needs improvement.
Okay.
Let's start with that. And let me motivate that. So I think, first of all, and again, this is really my opinion, of course, I do think it's good that we have regulation. Reason why I think it's good is because I do feel we need to have a bit of a framework around what we're doing and why we're doing certain things. I mean, don't need to explain about like ethical AI and all those discussions. I do think it's good that we have a framework where we all kind of agree, like, this is how we see a certain technology and the things that are good and are not good. The other thing is also that I feel once regulations for tech are coming up, that also government acknowledges finally that technology is really important. I think for a long time they saw it as some kind of funny, gimmicky thing.
Yeah.
And the fact that we now actually have some heavy regulations also, I mean, there's a lot to say about those regulations, but I do think it shows that governments do see the impacts and the importance of those.
So as soon as they realized that it's not all fun and games, they started heavily regulating it. So what is the current biggest problem that the European tech scene faces?
Well, so I think, first of all, there's way too many regulations. I mean, AI Act, Cybersecurity Acts. There's so many. So I think that's a key problem, that there's just way too many regulations. I think especially as a small company, there's so much you already need to work on. And to even understand all these regulations, it's just too much. The other thing is, timeline, right? It takes ages. I mean, like, to just give an example, not even too long ago, we had the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. And it took more than 20 years. I think it's, more than 20 years to come up with these regulations. So that's
Crazy.
like insane. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And then I think the third thing to make it even more difficult is also that, yes, we're working on those EU regulations, which I think is really good for competitiveness. But then on the other hand, because it goes so slow, every country is still trying to create its own little thing within those regulations. So if you want to scale, you still need to navigate all those different countries.
So basically the fragmentation of the policies and the regulatory fields inside the European Union is crazy. And we have this problem, but what is the thing that actually improved? We're talking about, everything is shit and everything is super, super bad. But has there been anything that has actually gone good?
Well, yeah, of course. And I mean, I think first of all, what has been going well or better than before is that I think when we kind of started to create a lot of those regulations, tech regulations, it was just a bunch of policymakers together deciding on these kind of things. And I think now, and there's different associations and organizations that really kind of bring like really founders together and really the voice of the ecosystem. And I do see, like, I've been part of a lot of those lobbying discussions that now more and more founders are actually invited to join have a seat at the table. So I do think that's good. I mean, we're not there yet, but for policymakers to understand that they really need to be part of the discussion, that's what I see more. So that's a good thing.
Fantastic. We see a lot of change in the DEI movement. I would say that it's a complicated field that for a person that is not involved in it every day, it becomes hard to navigate it. On one hand, you see like a good movement of getting, diversity inside the companies, inside the boards. And then on the other side, you see companies hiring because of DEI and kind of going over the limit. So again, could you give us an overview of the current state of the DEI movement and how will it change in Europe?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to DEI, there's still a lot of work to be done. I think it's good that more and more people, also from almost like a moral imperative, understand like it's not okay anymore to just hire a bunch of white guys, just to say it very bluntly. So I think that's good. On the other hand, I also feel that when it comes to DEI, and I mean, I've been working in the DEI space for quite some time, I think we haven't been really good at going beyond the fluffiness. So it's like, oh yeah, it's nice to have more women or it's good to have more people of color, but like, okay, but why? So I think there is also, when you look at the DEI space, like it's also good to like criticize that a bit, because I think it has been too much only about like really the visibility part of
Yes.
it. So, I mean, what you see right now is, again, if we go back to regulations, there is quite some regulation coming up. I think two very important ones is one is the pay transparency. So that's a very simple one. Still, although by law it's not allowed, you still see a lot of companies where pay is not m- yeah, especially men, women are not paid equally.
Mhm.
Shouldn't be okay, but it's still happening. And with this regulation, it's about creating more transparency
Mhm.
around pay. A very simple one, for example, that it's not allowed anymore for you as an employer to ask someone about their previous pay, which I think is going to make a huge difference. And then the other one is the EU Accessibility Act, and that's more on how can we create more inclusive products and services.
Mhm.
And I also think there, if I look at kind of the landscape, I think too often in the DI space we have tried to kind of criticize people for not doing well, and I think we should also focus more on the companies that are actually doing well. And there is a correlation between companies being diverse and companies being more successful. And I think we need to tell those stories more. So I think that's kind of where we need to go
Mhm.
more towards too.
And what would you say to the people that argue that the DEI movement is not in the best interest of maximizing shareholder value, the main point of running a company? Why I'm asking is that we see a radical shift in the US. We see the US was the first major market that was kind of implementing those DI policies, those
Yeah.
big five firms. And now we see them radically shifting. What would you say to those people who would argue that it's not the best way?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like, first of all, I always tell people, let's indeed have this discussion.
Mhm.
I think it starts with actually listening to those people instead of saying they're wrong. I think once we start doing that, we're definitely not being inclusive. So I think it's also a bit practice what we preach. I mean, if you like, there is a lot of research that shows that companies that are more diverse are on the long term more successful.
Mm.
I also think indeed we need to be honest that on the short term, diversity is super hard. It's super hard because we're talking about cultural change and cultural shifts.
Mhm.
And I think everyone knows how hard that is. So it's true that on the short term, it's definitely like it's not always paying off. But to those people, I would say that, first of all, indeed, the business case, you really reach a bigger audience if you work in a more diverse way. There's a bigger group to reach. So I think that's one. And I think the other one is also, especially if we look at the next generation, they find it more important. So also to be an attractive employer,
Mhm.
it is becoming more important for
Mhm.
people to feel like they work in an inclusive environment.
Fantastic. Maybe I should have started with this question before starting to discuss DI, but maybe you could explain to the people who are a bit confused like me, for example, what is the essential value of a DI? What is DI?
Yeah. So I think, again, like DEI, I mean, it stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
So I think diversity is always the thing indeed about, okay, having more women, people of color. So that's really, well,
Mhm.
diversity in the word as it is.
Mhm.
Then inclusion is really about, well, everyone should be welcome no matter what your background is. So
Okay.
that's really including everyone. But when it comes to equity, that's really about being honest about that not everyone has the same chances. Like not everyone started from the same starting point, and giving those people who maybe had a harder time or came from a different direction
Mhm.
to give them the extra tools to really be equitable.
Mhm.
So I think that's where the different terms come from. And I also think indeed it's true that a lot of times those terms are being mixed up.
Yeah.
And especially that a lot of companies nowadays are quite good at being diverse,
Mhm.
but then how are you really also inclusive and equitable? And I think that's also where, if we, for example, talk about like attracting diverse talent, I see a lot of companies, if you only focus on the diversity part, it's really about attracting, but not really retaining, if you
Yes.
understand what I mean.
I think there was an example we discussed with Emmanuel Guilleron from Post Foundation, is that you see companies hiring people that have different needs and so on, but you just put them in one corner.
Yeah.
And you're not really including them
Exactly.
in the conversation. I think I would argue that it's better off not hiring them at all if you're not willing to invest time and resources into including them at work, because having a person sitting kind of on the last bench of the school is, and the same way you could argue that you have workers, really brilliant guys, and usually, they're usually, software engineers that are not really intended, or they're not really open for the discussion. But if you're not really including them in the discussions, in the everyday work of your company, I think that's not so good.
No, it's not. And it's true that it unfortunately happens still too often. I think it's really important to realize that if you hire someone who is like the first person, so to say, the first woman, the first person of color, the first person with a certain disability, maybe, it's not easy.
Yes.
But I think on the other hand, it also opens up a lot of new things that you've never thought of before. So I think it's more about being very honest that it's not easy also towards that person. And there's this saying that I actually think is really good, is it's all about being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think that's exactly what it is. Like it's super uncomfortable sometimes, but I think that's okay. And I think if we go even beyond that discussion, the question is, it's indeed about cultural change. It's not easy. It's actually about disrupting a whole company in some kind of way, like the culture of it, the way you do certain things. And I think the question is, can we actually afford to not disrupt? So I think that's always how I like to look at it.
Fantastic. You're the head of ecosystem at the Next Web. I would argue that the conferences as such are evolving quite rapidly. We're sitting here at SuperNova, super cool event. But as if the initial value of a conference of coming all together, listening to interesting talks, and then networking, although I don't really like this word, but meeting new people is shifting. It becomes like a platform where you can sell your stuff, where you can make anything but have a fun time. What do you say to those people? I don't think so. I think conferences is still a huge part. I think it's an important thing that we have. But what is the intrinsic value of a conference?
Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah, and I mean, it's true. I also first of all, I think if you've never really been to conferences, I also know it can be a little bit awkward, or you don't really know where to start. Indeed, especially if indeed we start to talk about the networking bits. But what I do feel conferences are still very important. I think going post COVID, online, I think everyone's ready for being together in person again, because the connection is just different. But the shift I do see is that it's more about the quality of connection. So I think more the value of those connections. So you don't just want to meet anyone. I mean, it can be fun just to have a drink, but I think, and that's where I feel, of course, that there's a lot of great ideas and innovation at conferences on how you can make more valuable connections. And I think as long as that is around, that I think will stay around, we will be going to conferences. And I mean, again, if we go back to my title, ecosystems, I think an ecosystem is you have the founder, you have the investor, you have the policymaker, and they all have a different role to play, right? And also at a conference, I think you if you're your conference is successful if you're able to accommodate to those different people in that ecosystem. So where maybe in this case a policymaker comes more for inspiration, a founder really wants to sell its product. So I think you just need to find the right ways of giving them what they want.
Okay. And what is your what is your advice to all of the ecosystem heads of Europe? What do you think should be the main focus in the upcoming years?
Oh, you mean in terms of trends or like the way they approach the ecosystem?
Absolutely. So the way you form an ecosystem is quite different and it's changing quite rapidly. So my question to you is to all the ecosystem hubs across Europe. We have people driving it, people like you, people all over Europe. What is the advice? What should you look out for, and what should you focus on?
Oh, so I think in like I mean, what I really try to do is it's great that we have like things like ChatGPT and it's like a great source to get information really fast. But what I really try to do is to actually talk to founders, actually go out there and talk to them. Like people who are like, oh, I'm done with startup pitches. I'm like, no, I'm not. It's actually good to be there. Because a lot of that information and understanding why people do the things they do, you don't get that from like all those online sources. So I think still going out there and really talking to the people you're doing it for is very key. Yeah. And I think the other thing as well is just it's very important to stay really curious. I mean, tech and innovation go fast, and I think it will only go faster. Yeah, so I think really staying curious. Like for me, I go to a lot of conferences. I always try to pick like the weirdest talk I can think of, and that's the one I go to.
Fantastic. Being curious. Let's imagine that people of underrepresented backgrounds are listening to us. Maybe they have been neglected. Maybe they have been treated differently. What is your advice to them?
Well, I mean, I think there's two sides to the story here. I think my advice to them is ask for help. I think a lot of times that can be very scary. But I think if you ask for help, there's not a lot of people who will say, I'm not gonna help you. It's yeah, I think that's number one. I think on the other hand, for people like who have been part of the ecosystem for long, also really try to open up, like try to be open to those new perspectives. And yeah, maybe even how do you say this? I always have a really good saying for it. Well, I'll get back to that later. But I think there it's also indeed like when I go back to like staying curious. It's really true, and I mean it sounds maybe a bit cheesy, but it's really true that people who come from completely different backgrounds can look at a certain idea or trend in a completely different way that you never thought of. Yeah, so I also feel on like especially if you look at kind of the conference environment, there's a lot of great initiatives where we try to bring in underrepresented groups or people who haven't really been part of the community. I do think when we open up our communities for them, I do think we shouldn't underestimate the confidence building part that comes with it. And I think that's also a shared responsibility. That maybe some of the skills that people who have been part of the ecosystem grew up with see as something natural, like how do you network? How do you present yourself? And I feel, and that's something that we actually try to do, is not just give people access to our conference, but also do conference building around it. So that when they come in, they can actually work with certain confidence. Because I think that's also the fair thing that we should all do.
Fantastic. And let's wrap up this conversation with two questions. What is your ecosystem superpower? What are you really, really good at building ecosystems?
Oh, it's a good one. Well, actually, I think, and that I feel has helped me a lot, I always try to position myself as an enthusiast and not so much an expert. I think being like, as I said before, being really curious and enthusiastic about new stuff brought me really far. But I also think that the good part about that is when you frame yourself as an enthusiast and not so much as an expert, you can ask the stupid questions. So, and actually, a lot of times the stupid questions are like the questions that everyone wants to ask, but they don't dare to. So that's what I really try to do, and I think it builds connections. People remind you, whether it is in a good way or a bit of a weird way. I think it's fine. And as long as you're just super enthusiastic, like again, like who doesn't like to talk about something they're really good at where someone else is very enthusiastic about?
Fantastic. And my last question is, Yeni, what is your dream?
Yeah, that's such a big question.
Yes.
But to be honest, I think to kind of stick a little bit to the ecosystem thing, I'm completely fascinated by space tech. Actually, I know later today there's a really cool talk that I definitely want to see around space tech. But my big dream would to be really to do something in space tech, even like hopefully one day go to space. And yeah, add my perspective, my experience really from a policy side to that.
Fantastic. Yeni, thank you so much for this conversation. It was really fun and interesting talking to you.
Great, thanks.
Thanks a lot.